Okay. Hi, I'm Coach Loretta, and I'm here with Coach Reese today from Trail Run Coaching, and we're here with the Dirt Trail Running Podcast. When Coach Reese and I get together, we like to talk about the dirt behind coaching and running and all of that great stuff. And then Michelle Hartwig, the owner of Ornery Mule Racing, also does the Dirt Trail Running Podcast, where she focuses more on community and races. But together, we all are working on the mission of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, kindness and community. So welcome to our show today as we deep dive into talking about race day strategies, positive splits, negative splits, even splits. What are they? What are they all about? And how should you go about approaching a race? So welcome, Reese. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. Can't complain. Just got back from a run for myself. Oh,
nice.
hold on. There we go. Sorry, still trying to figure out this technology thing. I'm doing pretty good. Can't complain. Just got back from a run myself. Just kind of waiting for the snow to hit. I'm going to be going into the chiropractic clinic that I work at pretty soon, and yeah, just hanging out and having a good day now. So, how about you, Loretta?
Well, for those of you who know me, they probably know I'm a little bit of a basketball, football, college junkie. And I'm getting super excited because the basketball tournament, actually, University of Michigan is playing Rutgers right now as we speak. So as soon as we get off, I'm going to be tuning in and watching the game and getting excited for brackets and March Madness. And that's what I do all March.
Awesome. Good.
Are you into that? Are you into the basketball March Madness?
To a certain degree. I mean, I like to follow a little bit just so that I can have conversation with other people. But I mean, most of my entertainment, like this morning when I was running, was like listening to AJW's Crack a Brew podcast and listening to physiology podcasts. And, when for entertainment, I'm usually just watching some, like shows like Ted Lasso has been a favorite of mine for the past couple of weeks or so. So yeah, my entertainment bandwidth is pretty taken up right now for any extras.
Right.
But I definitely can appreciate some amazing athletic talent. That's for sure.
Right. I think that's what I love about the basketball tournament is that you just never know what way it's going to go. I mean, you can take, a top seed and a bottom seed, and sometimes the bottom seed comes out ahead. I mean, these are just super close games and they're fun to watch. So that's what I'll be doing. Besides running, I'll be watching basketball. So yeah. So let's get into our conversation a little bit about race day strategy. So let me just kind of set it up a little bit. So I mentioned there's negative splits. So that's where you're running a race and you speed up the second half of the race. So you start out at a controlled pace and then you slowly speed up. And then there's positive split where you start out the race faster and then you end at a slower pace. And then even split, I think it kind of implies what it is. It's exactly, you're going for that same split for the entire race. So when we're talking about these larger ultra races, this becomes a really big conversation, I think. And different people approach these races in different manners. And, also there's training that goes along with it so that you can be successful in implementing one of those types of strategies that you choose. So what are you thinking about this, Reese?
Yeah, personally, I mean, I think it's important to delineate, are we talking about negative splits like in just racing, or are we talking about in training too? And I think people hear the topic of negative splitting, and it's kind of this golden egg of like, oh, that's what everybody should strive for is negative splits. But I think with the variability that ultra running can bring us in the courses, the temperature, the time of day with which we're running, your race strategy is always subject to I don't want to say subject to change, but subject to further analysis as far as what will bring you your best performance. So I think there's times where you can make an argument that a positive split is going to be the best case scenario in a race. Sometimes an even split is going to be the best, and sometimes negative splitting is too. So I'd love to talk more about just how you help your athletes determine based on a course profile and their personal capabilities. How do you talk with them about setting expectations for splits in a race?
Yeah, that's a great question. We do have a look at what does that course look like? Is it going to be a lot of climbing, or is it more of a flat course like Hennepin per se? So you're kind of need to look at that to strategize. And the other thing I like to talk about is what's the weather going to be like on that day? If you're going to go to a race and it's going to heat up in the day, and it's going to heat up in the day, that race may make more sense to start and go for positive splits where you're starting out 5 or 10 seconds a mile faster because you know the slowdown is coming when that heat, comes up, those pieces. Or what time does the race start? Some races start early in the morning. You can get in a lot of good miles throughout the day, but then usually when you get into the darkness, your pace seems to slow a little, so like looking at those kind of factors, I think are really important. How about you? What kinds of things do you think about with your athletes?
First thing I like to think about is I like to think about somebody's previous capability, like if an athlete has run that particular race before, cool. Let's try to like break down the splits of where were you at certain times during the race? What was your overall pace during the race? And then analyzing the course profile, I think is kind of the biggest, like the first thing that I would go for instantly, because if you have a race that's going to be primarily flat, let's say you're talking about a 50-mile race, you go through 50K and you have maybe 1,000 or 2,000 foot of elevation gain, and all of a sudden in the last 18 miles you have a good 5,000. That's a way different race than if you're talking about like a net downhill race or a pretty steady uphill race. So I think course variability is like first and foremost. So I really like to talk with my athletes and just say like, hey, if we're gonna be training for this race and it's gonna be a flat, fast 50K and then 18 miles of some serious elevation, then we should expect that the second half of the race you're probably going to be going a little bit slower. But when we're thinking about positive or negative splits, we can think about pace or we can think about effort, right? So I think for ultra running, thinking about setting up your effort splits to be fairly even throughout the race, if not like giving a little bit more effort at the end is going to be beneficial. So I think there's a different way to kind of view it.
I agree. And I think that as we get into training, let's talk a little bit more about that piece and what kinds of tools that we can use to gauge that, to determine where we are and how we feel in a race. I was kind of doing a little bit of looking up some things that I had seen before, but just to have some hard facts about different courses. So if you go to the Umstead 100 site, they do talk about some data that the race director has collected to determine like what is the rate of positive splitting at his event. And so what he came up with is that people that were going for sub 23 to 24 hours, they had about 27% decline that second half of the race. And then those people that are in the 28 to 30 hours was more like 30%. So I think it's kind of a good starting point, and you kind of start seeing that as you start looking at other race courses. Some very similar data, I think, comes out. If you at all view like Desert Solstice, they have some pretty elaborate charts and showing, where athletes are and how their race is declining or staying steady throughout the entire race. It's kind of interesting data to watch, and they'll often compare it to other elite athletes that have done some of these kind of events. So good information to kind of think about a little bit, but it's really looking at, in this situation, the first 50 compared to the second 50. And then I was also looking at Davy Crockett was saying the Wasatch he did in 2016 and kind of looked at that. People that were sub 24 were 20% slower in the second half than the first half, but overall the entire field was about 30% slower. So we're kind of seeing that trend, in a lot of these races. And then he mentioned doing the Bighorn 100, and he said for him, he's done lots of races, but for him, the one that he was most close to even splits was Bighorn. And he attributed it to the first half being more difficult than the second half. And so they kind of came close together. And also the last 12 miles of that race is downhill. So, there's, like you mentioned, Reese, there's so many factors in the course, terrain, elevation, those pieces that come together that can impact, how that's going. And I think those races are kind of a variety of races. I think Umstead tends to be a little bit of a flatter course as opposed to Wasatch and Bighorn, and they all have a little bit different settings. So anything to add, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about those looped events, like Desert Solstice, like the 100 mile in Arizona, I forget what it's called. You mentioned it before.
Javelina?
Jeez, Javelina, yes, Javelina 100.
Yes.
I think those are really awesome, and even Tunnel Hill to a certain degree, Hennepin, since the course is very similar. Like when looking at splits and we can say, okay, you're going to run this exact same loop so many times. I think that's a really good indication too of like, okay, how is your pacing strategy working or not working? So I mean, if your loops are very even and it's a fairly controlled environment, let's just say it's a race that lasts no longer than 6 hours for somebody, so it's going to be relatively in the same time of day or so. The best thing that you could hope for is, to start off with a particular effort level, and then continue that effort level for most of the day, and then increase that effort level. And what we usually find is that even though your effort level may be increasing, since you're fatigued and you've been out on your legs for such a long time, your pace isn't necessarily increasing all that much. So part of me almost wonders if everything was super controlled, if you were running something like 6 days in the dome and you had a particular race that you were doing, if you are negative splitting, does that mean that you're leaving a little bit of fitness on the table, or you're leaving a little bit of performance on the table that could have been realized since you were finishing faster than you first started? Or would the best thing in these ultra circumstances be to continue a fairly even split because your effort level is increasing, everything's getting really hard, but you're maintaining that same pace, So I think there's so many different ways to think about even and positive and negative splits that, like my brain is just, as we're talking about this, I'm thinking, what, if we can keep a steady effort for most of the day, and then really, like, once we know that your race completion is kind of in the books, increase that effort level and maintain your current pace, I would say that's the best type of outcome that we could have. And
Right.
there's always a point in a race where, say if we're running a 50 mile and you get 45 miles in, you can guarantee that, like, regarding a complete disaster, a complete blow up, those last 5 miles, like, you've already covered most of the distance. Chances are you're going to complete. So that's kind of that cool area where you can start to play and start to increase the effort. That increase in effort may or may not translate to an increase in pace. But as long as you're, able to give a little bit at the end and continue those even pace splits, then I think you've squeezed just about all out of your training that you could for that race. So
I think that's really good. And that's another piece I think I look at is that cumulative fatigue, right? It really sets in that second 50. So personally, when I go into a race, I was told this by an old ultra runner friend of mine and this is what I really have always worked towards, is hit the first 50 feeling fresh. If you hit the first 50 feeling fresh, you're good to go, and so that's been kind of my strategy. First 50 feeling fresh, 100K feeling good, and let's see what we have that back half of that race, because it's a long journey. So I did a little, and you kind of brought this up a little bit, but I did a little bit of research on some of our elite athletes that we look at, right, to see what are they doing out there. And when you're talking about desert solstice, who comes to mind but Nick Curry. This 2 years ago, I guess, not this last desert solstice, but the year before, he set a 24-hour American record with 173 miles. Impressive. But the really impressive piece is Nick is a master at negative splits. He's been working very hard on this, really strategizing how to get to that point. And he ran the last mile like at 6-minute pace after 173 miles. Any comments on that? I mean, that's just really an impressive feat.
Yeah, and I think that all comes back to training, kind of like we talked about before. Is Nick spent months. I've listened to a bunch of podcasts with him just about that. I remember when he did set that American record, and he did like 2 or 3 different podcasts I found super fascinating. But everything harks back to, what have you been practicing in training, and what is the course going to throw at you, what is the temperature going to throw at you, and what is the nighttime going to throw at you. So I think
right,
Nick was
absolutely.
really diligent in, he had the course to his favor. It was just on a flat track. So of course you can be really specific with how you prepare for that type of event. So he was doing a lot of, track workouts, getting his mindset ready for just running loops. He kind of had an idea of what the weather would be like, because at that time in Arizona, it's fairly consistent within, a 10-degree range or so. And he was doing some training in the daytime as well as the nighttime. So by the time he went in, he already had this idea of, I've been doing my long runs at X pace. This is how I've been feeling, and then how can I start the race so that way my effort level at the beginning is a lot lower than my effort level at the end. Because I'm sure when he's running, when you run 6-minute pace and it's mile number one, it's a completely different feeling than when it's 6-minute pace at the end of 170 miles, just like you were alluding to before. So the effort level increases, and I think he's smart. He knows that. So he knows, hey, at the beginning of this race, if I feel like I'm anywhere near like a steady intensity, a marathon intensity, a half marathon intensity, he's going way too fast. So I think, he's probably smart in the idea that like he knows based on whatever like pace he wants to negative split for the first and the second half, it has to be at this easier intensity that he can do for the first 12 hours, knowing that, hey, for 12 hours, this is going to be bread and butter. I'm just going to be able to click this off. I'm not going to have too many stomach issues because he was training with his nutrition and everything. So I think, since in that type of arena, you can really control most of the variables, I think he had that, that playing to his favor where he could really go and set the scene and practice or execute his negative split strategy because he didn't have elevation. He didn't have drastic swings in temperature. He didn't have, like nighttime to contend with when you're in the middle of, I guess nowhere. Like if you're at Wasatch, if you're in Bighorn and there's a stretch between aid stations, it's definitely going to play on you psychologically that, like you are in a wild area and it's up to you to get from point A to point B. So you might be a little bit more conservative in the effort that you put out. So I think, in that performance, it absolutely makes sense that he can practice his negative splits. He can go to a track. He can run at different times during the day. And that's, something that he looked back on in training and said, you know what, I specifically prepared to do this. So right. I think it's going to be interesting when we talk about our training piece is like, okay, now how do we apply this in our training so we can get an idea of what we're capable of executing on race day?
Right. Well, I've had the opportunity to run with Nick at a few of these 24-hour races and even the honor of podium with him at Alexander County, which was pretty cool. Standing next to him, and he has some definitely shown himself in the ultra world, and especially the 24-hour events, track events. But it's interesting to watch him pull it off, right? Because it takes a lot of, I think, mental strength to hold back in the beginning of the race. Most of us, the gun goes and we go, and we think, oh, today might be my lucky day, and I can hold this race all day. And you find out too late that it wasn't your lucky day and you really should have held back a little bit more in the beginning. And it takes a lot of restraint, I think, because we're talking about somebody who's very competitive at these events, and he's back in the pack. He's just cruising that first part. I mean, I've went past him going, I shouldn't be passing Nick. I know I shouldn't be passing Nick, but you're on a 400-meter track and you're looping and he's just cruising. And then later you start seeing him start passing everyone. So it's really kind of interesting to watch his strategy. And I think he might, I don't want to speak for Nick, but I think he might think of it as a little bit of a mental game. It's kind of entertaining for him, I'm sure, to know, kind of what his strategy will be as the day folds out if everything comes together.
I think he's a fantastic example too, because he is somebody that does these flat 24-hour races. And I know that he and his brother Jamil at Aravipa, shout out, because everything that they do is awesome, especially with live coverage and whatnot. They're absolutely crushing the game. They also just ran Hard Rock this past year, I believe. It was either this past year or the year before.
I think it was this past year. I was thinking about those stats actually, because he worked for negative splits at that race as well, I believe.
I'm actually trying to look up his Strava right now to see if I can find his Hard Rock.
Okay. I'll let you look that up, and I'll talk about a few other elites just to kind of keep us moving. Because opposite of Nick is Camille Herron, and this just an example in 2018, again at Desert Solstice, she went with a positive split, setting a record, and the first 12 hours she ran 89.5 miles, and the second 73.4. So it was like 45% going into positive. I found a quote by her, and she said, it's almost inevitable you'll have a positive split for 100 miles plus and up. The fatigue is so extreme. So it's interesting the different ways these both very successful elites have approached these big and tackled these big ultra events. So I think that's good to know. And then let's talk a little bit about Zach Bitter, right? In 2000, I think it was 2019, he set the 100-mile world record at 6 days in the Dome with a negative split. he ran 11 hours 19, and he was 2 minutes negative. So when we're talking about negative splits, it's not always a huge amount, you know, so 2 minutes is pretty big to be able to pull that off that second half. So, and then if we look at some like little bit shorter events, Kipchoge in 2019 had a marathon record of 2 hours, 1 minute, 39 seconds. He was negative. His first half of the marathon was 61:01, and the second was 60:33. So, you know, interesting to kind of look at the elites and how they approach it and how they kind of pull off these different types of events. Were you able to pull up that information about Hard Rock?
Yeah, so I'm actually looking at it right now. I'm trying to look at it just so I can get in like an accurate portrayal of what happens. Okay, so it looks like half of the race, and he finished 7th. Major congratulations. That is absolutely amazing, and I hope there's no conjecture about us pulling up this info, because it is public on his Strava, and I think it's absolutely fascinating. But it looks like 50% of the race was completed in 14 hours and 17 minutes, and he completed the entire race in 30 hours and 37 minutes. So he had a very slight positive split by like what is that, like an hour and change.
Right.
So that
which is pretty impressive.
That is just as close to, yeah, especially in such a mountainous race with huge swings in elevation, as well as temperature and time of the day, and fatigue going in with, just sleep deprivation and whatnot. Huge congratulations. But as somebody who practices his negative splits so diligently, it's interesting to see that even, given all of these variables that he had to face on Hard Rock, even splits were harder to obtain. I mean, he's probably one of the only guys that's, been that close in his splits at Hard Rock. But in his podcasts, I do remember him saying, how he just let everybody go at the start, and then he was just flying past everybody, come towards the finish. So I think that kind of, in these shorter races too, like shorter ultras, sub ultras, we can say that, when you start the race with a lot of anxiety, it's going to make you go faster than what you really want, because you're not going to be able to feel your sympathetic nervous system kicking in. You're not going to feel your heart rate beating quite as hard. You're going to be tapered, so your legs feel good. So I think just having that mental reserve to say, like, given how great I feel, I'm just going to make this race feel really easy at the start, is probably like holding true to your pace goals regardless. Because if you have all that adrenaline, if you have all that excitement, the music at the start of the race, the gun going off, and you go that much easier at the start, you're probably just eliminating the discrepancy of like how good you feel via all of the sympathetic hormones kicking in, as well as how tapered your legs feel. So I think that's a great way to just say, you know what, like, it's going to be a 30-hour race. We're just going to start this nice and easy. We're going to have a great day, keep up on hydration, keep up on fueling, and then slowly start to just notch up the effort as we go on. So it would be interesting to talk with him, and maybe we could get him on the podcast to just kind of hash it out a little bit more, because I would love to hear about how his effort felt from the beginning versus the end, because I wouldn't doubt that his effort at the end was a heck of a lot higher, even if his pace wasn't quite lower.
Right. So it's, it's fun to like analyze what the elites are doing and see, how can we apply some of that to our training when we're thinking about our race day strategy. I did see a quick little article that quoted Ian Sharman, who is an elite runner and coach. And what he says is, ask yourself, are you breathing harder than average? Are you breathing harder than those around you? You should be thinking, how does my effort level feel right now? And I think that kind of says just what you said, kind of, you really have to be in tune with how you're feeling, and also remembering the beginning of the race, you could get caught up in all of that and think you feel good.
Yep. And if I could just give away a little bit of what happened at Kettle this past year.
For sure. We'd love to hear.
In saying that, like, I love talking with people. I love getting to know people. I love conversing, and especially with our ultra community, everybody has great stories. So at Kettle, for the first like 40 miles or so, we were running in a lead pack, and we were just talking and trading stories and getting to know each other, which is great. But then the competitive side of me is listening to everybody's breathing, everybody going up hills, asking people questions up hills and listening to how they respond, and how hard they're working. there was a couple people, you try to size up your competition and who's going to be, still nipping at your heels come later in the race. But when you're talking with somebody and they're having a hard time breathing going up a hill at mile 30 or 40, it's like, okay, cool. I can mentally just kind of separate myself from, okay, this, like, I don't have to stress about competition yet because, maybe they're not going to be able to hang in the last part. But that's really great that Ian Sherman says that too, is, how are you breathing compared to everybody else? Like, you may be in a lead pack, but if you're breathing way harder than the people in the lead pack, maybe you need to slow down to preserve your race and not
right.
Right.
I agree. And Ian also says that in competitive ultra races, that person leading it halfway doesn't always end up being the winner, right?
No,
so don't be chasing those first top people early on because they may be going too fast. I think a good learning experience has been for me is watching some of these races that are live streamed and kind of watching, and you're seeing their paces. And in a race, it's a little harder for me to rationalize when people are so far ahead, but I'm thinking, okay, I know what target I'm at. If they're that far ahead of me, they're racing 12-hour 100 pace, and it's like, I have to tell myself, don't get up there because most likely they're going to fade, right? But it is hard, especially if you're a competitive runner, to hold yourself back from some of that's happening because everybody's going out so fast. So watching some of that has been helpful. It might be helpful to some of our listeners too. Watching some of those live streams, it's nice to kind of see what people go through in an ultra, right? You can see the fatigue that's setting in. You can see, the walking that happens early. There's all of those things that you might be able to relate to and say, hey, that's not so not normal, and that it's okay that some of those things happen, because this is happening even to the elites, the middle of the pack, the back of the pack, and you can kind of see and kind of identify with that. I think that for me, that's been really helpful, having that live streaming to be able to see.
Yep. And a great way to think about, your race during the race, I found, after running Kettle last year, by the time you hit 50 miles in distance, you've only hit about 25% in completion, because the back half hits you so much harder. So I think distance and completion of a race are two different things. So just like you were talking about before, if you can get to mile 50 feeling fairly good, like you have some sort of reserve in your tank, then you can slowly start to dish out a little bit more effort here, a little bit more effort there, until you get close enough to the point where you know that there is a more than likely chance that you're going to finish. Yeah. And I think, feeling good at 50 miles is kind of a relative term, because nobody's going to, go into 50 miles thinking like, oh, I feel great. Like nothing's hurting. There's no rubbing on my pack. Like, my hydration and my fueling is all up to par. So relatively good,
Right. Yeah. Well, my first ultra that I ran, it was a 12-hour, and I was with my friend who had told me that he had learned that from another, older ultra runner. And I happened to pass him at that time because it was a looped course. And I'm like, feeling pretty good, pretty flow state. And I meet him and I'm like, just hit 50 and I feel fresh. He's like, oh, I know you do. I can see, because I'm like feeling so good. So, and that was like, at that point, that was the furthest distance. So it was like a PR distance for me, so I was pretty excited.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, let's put a bow on this this racing portion of negative splitting, and let's just kind of wrap up. So we kind of talked about, one of the biggest pieces in my mind when I'm talking with athletes is, let's look at what your training has previously told you you're capable of. Let's look at the course profile and see where can we dish out a little bit more effort, what portions are going to be a little bit slower. Then we can look at temperature, we can look at altitude, we can look at time of the day. And during training, like hopefully you were thinking about that the past, block leading up into the race, so that way you could practice certain paces at certain times of the day and at different temperatures. So I think that's a great way to try to set up your splits. Some races are not going to be guaranteed negative. Some races are not going to be guaranteed positive. So as long as you believe going into the race that you have a plan to maximize your performance, then try to stick with that as best as you can, and then adapt and problem solve as things come up.
Yes, I completely agree. I think that now we're going to talk a little bit about training and what you can do to work on some of those strategies in training, but you also have to remember that piece of adaptability, because race day may change things. It may change race morning when you get there and the temperature is different than you planned. that might be a whole nother, plan. So a lot of times with my athletes, I do talk about that. Like, okay, we know what the forecast is. We kind of know where this is going to go, but let's think about race day. You need to see what the the temperature is going to be on race day, and you may need to do some adjustments as far as your pace. Let's say it's going to be a cooler day, then maybe we can go for more of a negative opportunity. But if it's going to really heat up, then we may say, okay, we're going to start out a little faster, and it's going to end up being a positive day. And I think it's important to know that in your mind, that it's okay, that can switch around. I liked one of the things that an article I read by Damian Hall, who's a elite ultra runner from, I think, Great Britain. Is he from Great Britain, Germany? He says the 3 C's: stay calm, controlled, and confident. And I think that's the thing we have to do, is not get overly focused on that. There's so many variables that are really hard to control, right? When we're out racing, we can go in with a really solid plan and things may change. And so that's the strength of an ultra runner. That's what makes you a better ultra runner, is being able to make those decisions on the fly and be okay with that. So just know, going in, we train one way, it may end up coming up a little bit different. So let's talk a little bit. So Reese, if you have an athlete that's looking at a negative split, let's say that's the way we're going, do you want them to train every single day doing negative splits, or how do you approach that?
I want them training accordingly to what the workout is, because I think when I set up key workouts for my athletes, usually, let's say there's 2 key workouts and 1 key long run. My terminology is that a run is going out at any pace that you want and just collecting heartbeats. It doesn't have to be at a particular pace. I don't want you working hard. I want you enjoying yourself. So that's what a run is. A workout is where we actually have a defined intention for the workout. Is going to either translate to building into fitness, or it's going to translate to the race that we're planning. And then our long run, I also consider like a workout, just because of how long they usually take. Sometimes we add a little bit of quality running in the middle of a long run, but usually it's long enough to the point where it's going to affect you, like it's going to affect your body like a workout would. So usually with a lot of my athletes, they have a couple runs a week, they have 1, maybe 2 workouts a week that are key sessions, and then a long run. That's pretty staple, and that's something that a lot of coaches and other athletes are accustomed to. So if we're going out and we're just running, we're just collecting heartbeats, I don't want people to think about negative splitting, because I want them to think about having fun. I want them to think about going to some place that excites them. I want them to think about just collecting heartbeats and time on their feet, because that positive mindset of not worrying about like, okay, so like I have 6 miles. That means if I completed mile 1, I was feeling pretty good in 8 minutes a mile, but like, now I have to narrow down even faster. All of a sudden that easy run becomes like somewhat of a workout stressor, and it doesn't let you fully recover for those key sessions. So I think that's where the adage, keep your easy workouts easy and your hard workouts hard, comes into play. Now, when I look at workouts themselves, I don't particularly think about negative splitting workouts when I plan them. So somebody, let's say we're doing a VO2 max session. Let's say we do a 20-minute easy warm up, and then we do 5 by 3 minutes at a hard intensity with 3 to 4 minutes of rest in between. Rest could be either be complete rest, or it could be active rest, like walking, shuffling, just to get the athlete prepared. So depending on how that workout is actually programmed and run, you may negative split, you may positive split. I don't really care about that. I care about hitting those intensity zones, so that way we can express physical changes to your body. Negative splits, I think, can get in somebody's head and say like, oh, I negative split this run, like I feel good because the ending was faster than the beginning. But you know what? Sometimes we're focused on the physiological adaptations and not just the mental boost of like, oh yeah, I negative split this one. Let's say though that workout is, we're gearing up to a 50 mile and we're going to do like a very specific, actually, you know what? Race day is coming up. Let's make like a race, or Earth Day race. Let's make like an Earth Day example. So that is a looped course, 5.2 miles. And you do that, I believe, about 6 times, 5 times, 6 times for the 50K. So let's say we're 4 weeks out and we're going to do a key session. This is going to be like a race simulator. And I say, you know what? I want you to go run that same loop, and I want you to try it 2 times for sure, 3 times if you're feeling really good. Now I want you to start. So that's going to be a long run. That's going to be like 15 plus miles or so. Now I'll tell the athlete, you know what, go out really easy for the first loop. Just focus on, keeping your hydration up, keeping eating, having a great time. On that second loop, try to give it an extra like 10% hot sauce. I don't want you to go out really hard, but, like a little bit harder than that first loop. By then, you're a little bit more warmed up. You're moving a little bit faster. It takes a little bit more conscious thought to keep up on your nutrition, keep up on your hydration. And then by the time, if that athlete's still feeling good and they're like, yeah, I can really go for a third loop, then we go for a third loop. And that's when I say, hey, let's practice race intensity now. Let's practice race pace. Maybe somebody wants to complete those loops in an hour. Let's see if we can get that hour for the loop. And that is going to, what that's going to do is that's going to put a lot of fatigue on your legs from the first couple hours, but it's also going to give you practice of like eating while you're running, enjoying the scenery, going uphill, going downhill, putting a little bit of damage on your legs, a little bit of stimulus. And now we're going to make you run faster. I think that is a hugely key workout for that type of run or that type of race. So in that case, if I program, hey, I want you to go out easy and I want you to finish harder just to simulate what it's going to feel like come loop 3 or 4 of the race, then that's absolutely appropriate. So I think it really comes down to workout design.
Mm-hmm. Right. And, I think doing those progression runs are a really great way to work on that piece of negative splits. And I also think, you can put in some different type of maybe short intervals late into a run so that you're running on fatigue legs. So maybe you go out for a 20-minute, just moving my legs easy. And then you throw in some pickups part way when you're fatigued, and then that end with the easy. So there's different ways that you can kind of work on going from that slower pace to that faster pace. And I think it's a really good thing to kind of play around with, because sometimes we get set in a pace and it's hard to change it up, right? So training our body to be able to make those different adaptions throughout our run, I think is going to help us be able to hit those negative splits when it's time. But I really like what you say. It's like, really like listen to the plan, because when you look at the plan and if you change what you're doing that day, so if you're out there and you have easy run days and you're always going for that negative split, because it seems to be like the popular term and thing to do, right? Maybe it's a thing for Strava, I don't know. But when you do that, you're not really able to put all your efforts into those quality sessions that are meant to be harder on those days. So I really like that you brought that out, because I think that that's really important for people to hear, whether they're following a plan in a book or whether they're working with a coach, is really things are done with intention. And so using that and following that is going to help you be more successful on race day.
Yep. I think negative splitting I think it can be an unintentional byproduct of a proper easy run for sure. I don't think it should ever be the focus. And by that, I mean, if it's 5 o'clock in the morning and you're waking up and you're putting on your shoes and you only have an hour before going to work or getting the kids up, right? But let's say like, oh, yesterday's workout was kind of hard, or I did a strength training routine in the evening and my body's not quite warmed up. Take those first couple miles really easy, So, and then start at like a recovery pace and then build into your easy pace. And then maybe, hey, by the end of the run, maybe you feel really good. Your RPE is still really low. And it's like, you know what? Like, I feel good. My RPE is low. This still feels like an easy run, but I'm going faster,
Right.
I think it's dangerous.
And I think that's a good point. Yeah. I think the part that you want to be careful with is, so we're starting out in that recovery or zone 1, and we're moving into zone 2 or that easy piece. What we want to do is we want to keep it that way, that lower RPE of like 4 to 5, just easy. I can talk in sentences. I'm just out here moving my legs. My breathing is easy. Where it becomes a negative split issue that I think that is more concerning is when then you're getting into more of that tempo or lactate piece, where now you're starting to not be able to keep going at that pace without building that lactate. And then we're down another path where we're really stressing our heart when we don't really want to on an easy day. We want it to just be easy and stressing our body.
Well, and that's where, just with training age, the longer that somebody's been training and the more they can understand, like, hey, this is what tempo pace feels like. This is what threshold pace feels like. You're better able to
Yeah.
say, like, I shouldn't be at that at the end of a long run. If
Right.
it's not designed that way, if the
Right.
stress
Right.
that it's going to be put on your body is taken into account, that's fine. But we only have so much stress that we can dish out per week. So I think,
Right.
and it's hard, kind of like we talked about, like tempo and threshold intervals. Like when you are going at a pace that you can sustain for an hour to an hour and 15 minutes, if you only do that for 15 minutes at the end of a run, it's still not going to feel that tough. So it's really easy to trick yourself into thinking like, oh, I'm not really running that hard, but now it's like I'm finishing a minute per mile faster than where I started. And, you can kind of get caught up in this loop of I'm not recovering. And now I'm going to have to do, like a hard VO2 the next day, and I'm not going to be able to show up for it.
Right. Right. And I think that's really well said. I think that taking those easy runs easy so that we can recover and we can handle more miles and we can hit our quality sessions when it's time. But if you're always pushing that pace and trying for that negative piece, then you're going to have a little bit harder time recovering, and you're just not going to get the results that you could get if you followed that. So I want to talk a little bit about when we're in a race or in a run. You mentioned, being a little bit more experienced, you start coming in tuned a little bit more with your rate of perceived exertion. And I think for me, when I work with athletes, I like to have them become aware of heart rate. But I also, when we're thinking about these big events, or we're thinking about even when we get into 90 plus minute of training, we're starting to get into cardiac drift. We're starting to see a lot of things happening with our body that may impact our heart rate to make it look elevated. So we really need to look at, how do I feel? What's my breathing like? What's my effort feel like? So I think when we're thinking about whatever pacing strategy we do, positive, negative, or even, we need to be in tune with our body. So for me as a coach, I like to start out with people understanding heart rate. I want them to understand this is what it feels like, but I also want them to be aware that we can't become hyper focused on it because there's a lot of variables. Dehydration, sleep the night before, stress. I mean, so many parts come into play, right? But then if we do kind of get in tune with that, then we can kind of go, okay, this is what I feel like on an easy run day. This, maybe my heart rate's a little higher today, but I know I feel it's an easy run because I'm breathing easy. I can sing songs. I can sing the Michigan Fight song, and I'm not having to gasp for air. So I mean, thinking about those kind of things. Is that something that you work with that on athletes? And I also kind of blend in pace, because those three variables I think can help guide us, but nothing is set in stone. So you have to be able to kind of, again, that adaptable word, to bring that back together.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's huge. Taking heart rate, RPE, taking all these tools that we have to gauge our effort level and using them in conjunction with each other, using them in concert with each other to get a better understanding of, hey, what kind of load is my body under right now? I gave the example in a previous podcast just about how at Hennepin 50 mile, my heart rate was, at like 180 something for like 4 hours. And it's like, that's not possible, but my rate of perceived exertion was within myself, so
Right.
I was like, what, just don't even look at the heart rate, turn it off, flip it on a different screen, and just focus on my breathing and my mindset and keeping fueled and whatnot. And then there's other days like today on my long run, I had a cut down long run. I went about 15 miles and my heart rate was reading about like 145 the entire time, but man, was my RPE sky high. And when you think about, okay, yesterday I did a speed session, the day before that, I had another tougher run and whatnot. Not to get into my training, but
Right.
when you think about like,
But
okay,
great
like
examples.
even though my heart rate is at 145, my RPE is sky high. So you know what, like, don't keep going and just saying like, oh, my heart rate's at 145, I can handle this. It's like, no, if your body is talking to you, if your breathing is heavy, if your mind is just kind of like, oh man, I'm fatigued, slow down, like enjoy it,
Right. Right.
collect those heartbeats. There's no reason to, keep so hyper focused on one of these metric tools that we have to, or one of these metrics to gauge how hard we're actually working. So
Right, right. And one of the things I asked one of my athletes the other day, so she did a workout and her heart rate seemed kind of high. So I asked, like, how did you feel compared to what your heart rate showed? She's like, I felt really great. I felt really strong. She said, when I started out, my heart rate was higher than it normally is. So that was even before she got into the run. And then she says, it's probably because she's going to grad school. She said, it's because I have a 12-page paper due this weekend. So there's the stress,
Yeah.
So I think I like to ask my athletes often when I see a workout, because I don't know how you feel by looking at final surge. So I might see an elevated heart rate that really, I don't know that, oh, you went in dehydrated today, or, so just having those conversations and thinking about it is good. I mean, I do think, in the beginning, looking at heart rate is effective in maybe slowing some people down who thought they were at an easy pace when they really weren't running at an easy pace, right? Because I think our body sometimes becomes accustomed to a faster pace that we think is easy until we really realize what easy is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. So if all you're used to is running at between a 7 and a 10 rate of perceived exertion for all of your runs, of course, you're
Yes.
going to think that 7 out of 10, or what we call like a tempo intensity, is your easier intensity. And especially for people that are only used to running for 20 to 30 minutes at a time, because again, like we said, maybe you can go 20 minutes at a tempo intensity and it doesn't feel crazy hard because it's a pace that you can sustain for over an hour. But,
Right.
that's where sometimes when I have athletes step up in distance, they realize, oh, I've been running way too fast because I can't even sustain this for 45 minutes, And then on the other end of
Right.
the spectrum too, like I have some athletes who they do nothing but long endurance days and they don't really know where their top end is. So all of a sudden we do
Yes.
these,
Yes.
we do these harder workouts and they're like, oh, geez, so this is what it feels like when I'm going all out or at a 10 out of 10 rate of perceived exertion, RPE.
Right.
So I think that's another huge tool. And kind of like, with pace, if we're, trying to train for a particular race and we have an idea of a pace that we can do, let's say it's a flat half marathon or a flat 5K or a flat marathon, whatever the distance is. If you have like somewhat of a gauge of the pace that you want to hold and that's within grasp for you, and you're doing some intervals at that pace, sometimes that pace is going to feel great because maybe you had a great night's sleep, maybe you went in with some carbohydrates on board and you just kind of like had some good feelings because you had a great day at work and you're busting out and you're like, man, this pace feels so easy. Then there's other days where it's like, kid was up all night, didn't get any sleep, couldn't have a snack before my workout, but I tried to get this workout done and this pace felt like garbage, So I think, taking all those metrics into consideration can give you a better overall picture of what your intensity and your effort have to give, and then how you can either chip away at that or use that in your race strategy then.
Right, right. So, for our listeners, sometimes Reese and we get off on little tangents and we might have strayed a little way from the conversation, but I think it's all relative. And I think you can apply it still within the context of race day strategy with negative, positive, and even splits. And some stuff maybe we should go into a little bit more deeply on another podcast. Anything more you'd like to say as in regards to training for even and positive splits? Any piece of information you'd like to share?
No, I think that we covered everything pretty sufficiently. I guess the golden nugget out of here would be, look back at your training, see what you're capable of in training, follow your workouts as the coach prescribes, so that way you can try to get the physiological adaptation to perform at your race, and then use all of that information to gauge how are you going to handle the race now.
Right. And then I also think I don't believe there's a perfectly right or wrong way, negative, positive, even, right? I think it's individualized. I think it's looking at a lot of factors, the athlete themselves, the course, the type of day that's being thrown at you, the kind of training that you've put in. There's so many variables to look at. So I would say go out, you do you, what works for you on race day. Don't worry about what everybody else is doing and run your own race.
Yep. At the end of the day, our finishing time at the end of the race is the only thing that matters. So if you get the best finishing time via negative splits and you've practiced those, by all means, go forth. If you get the best finishing time via positive splits, by all means, go forth, execute your plan accordingly, adapt along the way, and have fun.
Yes, I think that sounds good. And I think it's a good wrap up for today. So we look forward to chatting with everyone again next week. Have a great week. It was super talking with you today, Reese.
Yeah, same with you, Loretta. Take care.
Bye.